Sorry for that delay. Okay, so this woman, her name is Shabran Palessa Mohammed, and she's an award-winning activist, lawyer, journalist, mediator, and impact strategist. And so she's begging for the world to understand the importance of what she's sharing. And she is part of the World Council for Health. So I will leave a link in the description of where you can keep up on this important story, because this important story is not over. So have a good listen here. And if I feel like maybe people need me to stop and explain what she's saying, because I've watched this a couple times, I will do that.
I'd like to shift from there to focus on the first part of my topic today, or presentation today, which is this high-level political declaration that was adopted through an act of fraud and an act of aggression at the United Nations General Assembly 78, 2023. So what happened was the UN attempted to pass a political declaration on the 20th of September. It was opposed by 11 countries who sent a letter to the UN General Assembly President, copying in the Secretary General Antonio Guterres. They sent the letter on the 17th of September. And these countries include, you'll see the flags on the left, Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Korea, Eritrea, Iran, Nicaragua, Russia, Syria, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. And if you're wondering what these countries have in common, many of them know what it's like to be excluded from decision-making as it relates to the UN or the WHO, different parts of decision-making that are involved within the establishment's cartel. But they also know what it's like to have sanctions imposed against them, or have wars declared on them and their people decimated. So certainly it appears to be a coalition that has united around a lived experience of being oppressed. And perhaps therefore they're able to see the oppression that is attempted to be facilitated by the UN and the extended cartel. Now, regardless of this letter by these countries, the 78th President of the UN General Assembly, Dennis Francis, approved what he called a historic but non-binding political declaration on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. On the right, an article that I wrote analyzing.
It's important that you all write down and remember that this is non-binding. So when our politicians say, hey, we have to do this, the United Nations is making us, we signed the documents, especially Canada, because we are not on the list of people that said no, but you will find out that 100 and something other countries actually said, wait a sec, we agree with these 11 countries that said no. So stay for that, because that's important. Non-binding means that when the politicians say, we have to do this, we have to destroy your lives, you can say, no, you don't. This is non-binding. These are just suggestions, but they don't really want us to know it's non-binding, because when it happens, everybody will pass the buck.
This very important development, United Nations Pandemic Power Grab, rejected by 11 countries. So what did they object to? This is a summary page. Number one, no consent, lack of transparency, and illegal unilateral coercive measures, or UCMs. Very important phrase. Number two, unfair practices, including veto, the lack of inclusion, the absence of balance, and neglect. 3, forced consensus, bulldozing, and ignoring the repeated breaking of silence by these various countries who were objecting. And 4, they called for a recall of the nature and legal standing of these UN meetings. This is groundbreaking. It certainly is a seismic shift in geopolitics. One more piece of information on the slide that's particularly important. One of the key issues that led to this revolt by these 11 countries is that earlier drafts of the Agenda 2030 Health and Sustainable Development Declarations included language calling on countries to refrain from promulgating and applying any unilateral economic, financial, or trade measures not in accordance with international law. In other words, they're essentially talking about sanctions. This paragraph was removed from the final draft of this political declaration, adding to the objections by these 11 countries. So let's break down some of these objections into a little more detail. And I've highlighted the core aspects in bold and/or italics. So what these countries are saying is that developed countries are not engaged in true and meaningful negotiations, but they're also talking about the lack of transparency and poor handling of your predecessor's team of all these processes. In other words, the General Assembly leadership's predecessor team of these processes, lack of transparency, poor handling of complaints. They also raise in item number 2, the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures. as an existential one for our people. A third of the world's population is affected by these illegal measures. There's ample evidence, including from UN sources, of the heavy toll caused by UCMs on targeted countries' capacities to achieve sustainable development and to make further progress in protecting the right to health. And thirdly, they insisted on the need to include in their concerns in these political declaration documents by the UN consensual language. The language needs to be consensual and inclusive. And of course, that was completely ignored as well. Now, this request was echoed, the need for consensual language, by a large number of delegations, including from the Group of 77 in China and from the Group of Friends in Defense of the UN Charter. That's around 135 countries. So while we may be thinking it's only 11 countries, what kind of impact can it have? They do have support for many of their objections by these extended groups comprising of at least 135 countries.
So they already have some momentum. So it's up to the ground level grassroots people to share what just happened September 20 at the United Nations while parents were marching across Canada saying, you can't exclude us from raising our children. This happened. So there was some big distractions from this that were coincidental. Okay. So this needs to be sent, not my episode. I'm going to give you a link of where you can send this video. You need to send this video to your MLAs, your MPs, the head of the NDP, Green, Liberals, Conservatives, the head of, all of the people that basically are running this country, to let them know that we know what just happened is a complete fraud. And when the head of the UN said, oh, we just agreed to all this stuff, which she's going to get to it, he literally ignored the failure and said, yep, everyone's agreed to this. This is great. We're moving forward. That's what a huge fraud the UN has become. And we need to get ahead of it and tell the leaders of Canada and all you guys watching from America, New Zealand, South Africa, I have viewers from all over, but this is you guys as well too. We need to get ahead of it and say, hey, we saw what just happened, complete cover up, complete fraud. So if you try to sell our rights to the UN when they come in and do what they plan to do, we already know it didn't pass. So we need to set them up for failure, because the fact this guy pretended everything went well is shocking even for the United Nations.
Some of the other objections raised, as you'll see in item 4, the legitimate concerns of a large number of developing countries have been ignored. I'll pause there to mention that developing countries essentially means countries that have been colonized, have experienced or are experiencing imperialism, and have experienced or are experiencing sanctions. So it's their duty to express their concerns. This is what these 11 countries say in this letter objecting to the UN political declaration. Number 5, they highlight the forcing of unfair practices which pretend to impose a kind of veto on certain issues and pretending to even prevent their discussion within the framework of intergovernmental negotiations. Now, the subject of veto is a very sensitive one. The United Nations has a Security Council, which essentially imposes its will on all of the other countries. So the United Nations is in fact a contradiction in terms and cannot work with the existence of the Security Council. Objection number 6, negotiations were not conducted in a truly inclusive, fair and balanced way. The delegations, these 11 countries' delegations, witnessed how some delegations were accommodated a great deal and others' priorities, including theirs, were bluntly neglected. They go on to highlight the outcome of this high-level political forum on sustainable development was reopened with the purpose of exclusively accommodating the priorities of a few delegations from developed countries. So it's very important for them to have actually highlighted this. And of course, nothing was done to reflect and accommodate the fact that the silence had been broken repeatedly. So in other words, during COVID-19, the UN and, or by extension, the WHO had developed the silence procedure where they would pass a document through, and because of what they called, the greatest pandemic of our lifetimes, the only way to actually object would be by breaking silence. So there's no formal process that the gathering with the assembly would have to go through. Doesn't make any sense to keep continuing.
The United Nations has literally become a mafia, you guys. They're not even following any kind of law. They've literally become a mafia. And so we need to actually call them what they are, because they are not following any laws.
Continuing doing that, considering there's no pandemic. In fact, there never was any reason to go through such an undemocratic process. But the silence was broken by these 11 countries and ignored by the UN. As they highlight in item 8, the attempt to ignore formal communications of delegations from developing countries. Item 9, the attempt to force consensus by your predecessor's team, as I mentioned earlier, as well as the lack of transparency, inclusiveness, and the efficient use of limited time available then to find compromises. So they waste time, and then they say there's no time to eventually or to try and attempt to find compromises to the objections that are raised. And under 12, they very importantly express their insistence to recall the nature and legal standings of these meetings facilitated through the UN, including but not limited to the SDGs, this high-level meeting on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, high-level meeting on universal health coverage, and a high-level meeting on the fight against TB. And so they raise a specific...
These people are awesome. Are you understanding what they're saying here, guys? Our delegation would also like to recall the nature and legal standing of the meetings in which the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals Summit, the high-level meeting on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response, the high-level meeting on universal health coverage, and the high-level meeting on the fight against tuberculosis will take place. So they're just saying all of this is illegal and unlawful. So good for these countries for speaking out. It took somebody, Canada, they don't even bother because we're just a bunch of, I don't even want to say the word what Canada is right now, but we got to wake up the Canadians.
The General Assembly Resolution 67/219, it's paragraph 9. All meetings convened under the auspices of the GA, General Assembly, shall operate under the rules of procedure of the main committees of the Assembly as applicable, unless otherwise provided for in the present resolution. Of course, this didn't happen because it was circumvented through the silence procedure, and the General Assembly President essentially deciding that this declaration had passed without the countries actually agreeing to it, and despite the objections to it. And so they expect this process, as you'll see in 15, to take place at a later stage. These are what these 11 countries are saying, but the General Assembly will formally consider the adoption of this declaration. So not through the President of the General Assembly. That's not the way it's done. It has to be done through the entire General Assembly itself. And this is why I'm saying what they did on the September 20th, even though this political declaration was non-binding, it is non-binding, is an act of fraud, and it is an act of aggression on all of these countries that have expressed objections, not only to what the UN is doing now in terms of pandemics, but how the UN has always operated. Certainly, all of these issues have surfaced, and I think that's a fantastic development. And so on the last slide regarding objections in 17, they say our delegations oppose any attempt to pretend to formally adopt any of these draft outcome documents in question. Excellent. 18, they reserve the right to take appropriate action upon the formal consideration of these 4 draft outcome documents in the coming weeks. And finally, they respectfully request your good officers for circulating as soon as possible this letter as an official document of the General Assembly. Seismic shifts. You can imagine all of the backroom negotiating carrot and stick tactics that are being used to bully or bribe these countries into accepting this high-level political declaration by the UN and anything else that's being facilitated through the World Harm Organization. And so these are some images. At the top there, you will see Tedros on the right and Guterres on the left, WHO and UN respectively. And at the bottom, Tedros on the right and Dennis Francis, the 78th UN General Assembly President from Trinidad and Tobago. So you obviously want to know, how did the WHO react? How do they react to this letter by these 11 countries? They simply ignored it. In point 1, Tedros, you'll look in bold, says 193 member states of the UN approved the political declaration, pandemic prevention, preparedness and response, completely ignoring the letter and lying. He then continued.
Bold-faced lies coming out of, I don't even want to say it out loud again because I want to keep this up. Bold-faced lies coming out of both WHO and the UN. I mean, can they get any slimier? Yes, they can. We're going to see them try.
With almost what I call delusional dishonesty in saying that member states have demonstrated that even at this time of division and polarization, it's still possible for countries to come together to agree in a shared response to shared threats. And of course, it's that same spirit of collaboration that we urge countries to demonstrate as they continue their negotiations on the pandemic accord and amendments to the IHR. Finally, he says a political declaration approved by Mr. Dennis Francis, not the UN General Assembly, and the result of negotiations under the able leadership of ambassadors from Israel and Morocco underscores the pivotal role played by the WHO as the directing and coordinating authority on international health. And he has to add that clause about sustainable financing to fund these unelected behemoth cartels. And how did Guterres respond? That's the Secretary General of the UN, again, unperturbed, saying that he urged all countries to deliver a strong, comprehensive pandemic accord focused on equity, as well as amendments to the IHR. And please do support the UN, including the commitment to increased assessed contributions to half of its budget.
Yeah, so basically, people said no. 100 and something other countries said, you know what, you guys are right. And then they said, we're not listening to you. We want to be the new world order and send us billions. Okay, guys? That is what happened here.
And supporting the proposed investment round. So more money laundering, racketeering, and fraud. And last paragraph, Guterres continued, despite the diplomatic fallout, because this is massive, what these 11 plus countries did, continued to outline what he sees as three key priorities in this international law gathering: the sustainable goals stimulus, tackling misinformation, which means the suppression of critical thinking, and responding to complex global shocks via a UN emergency platform. And I previously raised how dangerous it is to have the UN facilitating an emergency platform, because they have, in their minds at least, the authority to impose sanctions and to deploy what they call peacekeepers. What will it cost? I'll be very quick on this one. All bullet point one, about $2 billion has already been collated for a new World Bank managed pandemic fund. Bullet point two, Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed says many developing countries are drowning in debt. Correct. Bullet point three, Africa is not actually poor. And so to use Africa as a reason to extort money from other countries is not only unethical, it's fraudulent. Africa is not poor. The problem is that Africa's resources do not belong to Africa. And final paragraph, the executive director of UNAIDS agrees and highlighted the fact that African countries are paying debts larger than their health budgets. So why is this significant? One more slide. Global Threats Council, very important. This is another one world government toolbox that was raised at the UN. Critics, this is what critics are now saying. This is exactly what I predicted around June, July, when I said at the Better Way conference that I was going to pivot to the UN, and the article that I wrote in July around the subject of sanctions. Bullet point one, these critics are expressing misgivings about the ability of WHO to oversee and enforce the kind of tough, binding commitments that would be needed for pandemic response. These concerns have been behind the push to make the UN fora platforms for pandemic debate and decisions. You can see how there's a bait and switch going on here. Bullet point two, the advocates for a more UN-centered action have proposed the creation of an independent pandemic governance mechanism in the office of the UN Secretary General and/or a UN Global Threats Council. Bullet point three in bold, again, highlighted the creation of a UN-hosted Global Threats Council, and highlighted again, bullet point three, compliance and accountability. Very important language. And finally, the former president of Colombia agrees that the UN may be the better forum for pandemic preparedness because pandemic preparedness encompasses far more than health. So you can see how the UN will become the ultimate forum for example, climate change. And finally, on the slide, Santos told a UN meeting hosted by the Pandemic Action Network that the pandemic accord negotiations are still mired in confusion. By the time, if they're still mired in confusion by the time the WHO's INB meets for the 7th time later this year, someone has to say enough, we need to shift it back to New York. In other words, shift pandemic preparedness and response and compliance and accountability to the United Nations. So why is this significant? Some of our comments include, the UN is facing one of the worst scandals in its controversial history. It is a diplomatic fraud and act of aggression. The resistance by 11 plus countries has cataclysmic implications. The UN and WHO have gone too far. That's my analysis and comment. Professor Francis Boyle, who I sent my article to on what happened at the UN, said, this power grab is very dangerous. We cannot underestimate its significance. It's like a stick of dynamite ready to be exploded. It's all part of the globalist strategy to create a worldwide totalitarian medical and scientific police state under the guise of the WHO. 11 plus countries standing up to the UN is a great defeat for the globalists. Thanks. The last part of part A of this presentation and part B is much shorter. is just to highlight this article, and specifically because it deals with sanctions. So this article was, can the WHO and the UN impose sanctions for not obeying them in terms of pandemic preparedness and response? And of course, if you've been reading some of my content, you know the answer is yes. This slide merely highlights how inhumane unilateral coercive measures are because they impact on health, on freedom and sovereignty. But we are observing a seismic shift in geopolitics. The threats of sanctions to the UN seems to be waning in its fear factor, as we're seeing by the fact that these 11 countries plus others have stood up. Bullet point 3 is a report of the Special Rapporteur on the negative impact of unilateral coercive measures on the enjoyment of human rights. And this report is very important because it talks about how sanctions affect health. And finally, what I state in that article is the UN and the WHO have gone too far in their diabolical attempts to engineer a one world government. It is my anticipation, expectation, and forecast that more countries are going to be joining this coalition and asking themselves why they should remain members of the UN, United Nations, and the World Health Organization. And they'll have support from their people if and when they decide that they need to withdraw from the WHO and from the United Nations. All right, part B of my presentation for today is to highlight the Health Justice Conference that took place on Saturday.
Sorry, muted. I'm not going to play the rest because she was talking about an event that's passed already. But again, I will direct you where you can find this woman, this website. I've probably given you guys this website address 10 times in the last year, but it's so important as well. I did a quick video, which most of you probably saw, but for those of you that didn't, Leslyn Lewis from the Conservative Party of Canada has put forward a legitimate petition that our parliament in Canada has to look at to exit the WHO. She also mentions the UN and all their power grabs there too. So if you haven't signed it yet, this is going to be in the description as well. I think it's got about almost 30,000 signatures so far. Let's make it 10 million. There's time. Share it. Make sure you share it with everybody and tell them the importance of this. So yeah, guys, I can't tell you how important what this woman just exposed is. We have to get ahead of this and let them know that no, none of this passed. They just said, we don't care what you think. This whole vote was fake. We don't care what you think. And for those of you that don't know, the United Nations is actually the Committee of 300. It is actually the central bankers. And they've put forward leaders who have no problem with genocide. Look at Tedros. Anyway, please do share this, and I will be back again to actually out more information about. I did an episode with Parallel Mike, and I've never on Facebook had Facebook stop allowing shares and put up a sign that says has to go through security check. I've never had that. I've had stuff taken down because they say it's misinfo, which we know it's not. I've had, for bullying, which I wasn't even doing. I've never had sharing being stopped with a security check tag put on it. So they stopped allowing shares when I brought on Parallel Mike about the great raking, but put a T in front of raking. I can't even say the key words. So he's going to come back on again because he's discovered something else about Seed & Co, where if there is a cyber attack on online records of who owns what stocks, etc., in the banking system, then they will have no idea who owns stocks in the banking system. When there's a cyber attack, guess who gets ownership of, not that they don't own it already, of what you own? Because, my God, there's been a cyber attack. Shoot, guys, sorry. Well, we're just going to own everything, and then we'll just probably give you guys back credits, and it'll be digital, and everyone will just be equal because we have no idea of knowing who owns what. God, that darn cyber attack. I wonder who did that. It's getting even worse. So Seed & Co, C-E-D-E, and Co. If this app gets taken down because I'm talking about all this stuff, I'm going to redo this episode And I'm just going to play what she's saying without all this commentary, because that was a separate issue that is a lot easier to expose than what I just talked about right now. So maybe I shouldn't have done that, but we'll see. I'll redo it if I have to, and put it out as just on its own, what we need exposed. Again, send this to all of the leaders in your nation, not this episode. The link I send you showing this woman who is a lawyer, award-winning activist, award-winning journalist, mediator, and impact strategist. They would rather look at her than me talk about this stuff, because I'm just a podcaster. Please share this. Thank you guys. Thumbs up, share, subscribe, wherever you're watching this.